Okay, so thanks Alon, and thanks to museum, to the alum of the museum, and to Tal from the IFSN and everyone organizing, and to Emily who came to be our guest at the law school for the next month. So we are very happy to have her at the law school at Tel Aviv. And I'm going to talk, as you see, in the right to food and food security in time of crisis. And I would say it's kind of part of based on ongoing research. So it's tentative and still so. So what is the right to food? So actually, a right to food is actually recognized human rights in international law. And going back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is the fundamental document that really shaped the human rights movement after World War II, which talks about the right to standard of living, adequate for the health and well-being of himself and his family. Use the gendered language of 1948, including food. And later, this declaration has been translated, so to say, into treaties with more specific and mandatory provisions, and the Covenant on International Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, of which Israel is a member. The US is not, by the way, but Israel is. Says that the state party to the present covenant, including Israel, this was not forced by Aaron Barak or Hayut. The Israeli government has joined it its own will, by the way, during the Likud government, recognize the right of everyone to an adequate standard of living for himself and his family, again, including adequate food, and recognize the fundamental right of everyone to be free from hunger. And I already want you to notice that I actually hear two things which are connected but distinct. There is freedom from hunger, but not only freedom from hunger, right? There's also the right to food, which is adequate food, and which brings up a question: what would be fall into the standards? And another important document, which is a Rome Declaration on World Food Security, which was an important conference involving UN bodies, and which actually gives us one of the famous definitions of food security, which says that food security exists when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food to meet the dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. Now, we can talk about the relationship between the right to food and food security forever, but for me, they're pretty much corollary and pretty much the same and complement each other. We see that similar ideas. Now, to a large extent, for many years, to a large extent, it was kind of a disappearing social right. There was not a lot of talk about the right in food and food security. The fact that we are talking about it now, I don't think we had a conference about it 10 years ago, or even shorter framework. And I know that a few years ago, I co-authored the book, a chapter on right to food and food security as part of a book I co-edited in Israel in Hebrew, and I could hardly find any writing on the right to food and food security in Israel. I mean, one or two articles from social work, but nothing, and definitely nothing within the legal sphere. And I was trying to understand why. And I think that whereas generally maybe social economic rights will give them less attention sometimes, and rights like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, etc., the right to food suffered even more from less attention. And there are a lot of reasons for that. And I think that part of them is that, for example, the right to health, it's quite complicated, a complicated story, and I've been working a lot on the right to health. But in the right to health, at the end of the day, we understand that we want a public health system that would be good, that will give us health in a good level, that the access to the public health system will be based on our medical needs, right, and not based on our ability to pay. That's kind of our ideal of a good public health system, which we sometimes say we used to have. We still have to some extent. Of course, there are a lot of problems in it, but at the end of the day, notwithstanding many problems and critiques that we have, we do have the basis of a public health system that is universal in the sense that everyone should have access to it, etc. Again, with a lot of problems, of course, because a lot of things that actually eroded the program. But we know what we want. We want the state to make sure there's a good public health system. Either the state provided directly like the education system, like in the UK system, or at least the way the UK system used to be, or through the system we have here of sickness funds, but still regulated by the state with a national health insurance law. Okay, food is a much more complex story because, of course, by the way, health is not only healthcare, right? So, but at least the healthcare part, we do want that provided by in a public way. What do we want about food? Because normally when we think about the right to food, we don't want the state to provide us the food directly. That can happen maybe in some cases in schools, in prisons, in the army, but normally we want to cook our own food, to have it at home, etc. Now, moreover, usually when we think about social right, we think about how do we take something out of the market? We don't want health to be a commodity in the market. I mean, it could be also a private health system, which is a commodity in the market, but we want a good public health system, which will decommodify health, take it out of the market. The same for education. We want a good public education system that health will be a right, not a commodity, and will be accessible to us, again, in the public system. In food is literally, we buy at the market, right? So how do we take out of the market logic, something that we buy in the market? So that's part of the reason this right is so complicated, and part of the reason that it's very hard for a lot of people, I think, to understand, and maybe underdeveloped. The thought about it is underdeveloped. I think two other reasons. In food, there was a major role of civil society, and we heard about it partly before. Donations, food aid, food banks, which are from civil society. And so to a large extent, sometimes, okay, yes, maybe some people are hungry, so some organizations that will give them, some charities will give them food. And that sort of solves the problem, and we think about it less of maybe something that, how should the state take care of it? And then there's also this dichotomy of, do we have hunger or we don't have hunger? And whereas, as I said before, the right to food is not only about freedom from hunger. You maybe remember a few years back, there was a senior government official in Israel who said, when people started talking about it, yeah, but we don't have any hungry children in Israel, so that's not the problem. So we don't think, we are not, whatever is a hunger country of that moment, Biafra, Ethiopia, Sudan, we are not, I remember that even after the social protests of 2011, when as a result of the social protest, there was an attempt to do a basic law on social economic rights. And I was involved in it, partly through the Association for Civil Rights in Israel, and we wanted to put in a right to food security and right to food. But a lot of the people, even the progressive people who worked on the social protests, said, that's not a problem in Israel, right? Because, why? Because, we don't have hunger. So, but we have hidden hunger, we have food insecurity, and I think if you came here, you probably know about those issues. And you know that not only people who suffer from hunger and look like wasting or stunting, like those big bellies, many people suffer from food insecurity otherwise. And we know that the problem exists in Israel, and we do have data. Now, the Committee on Social Economic Rights, when it looked at the right to health, it talked about 4 pillars of the right to health. And they're quite similar to what people talk about when they talk about the pillars of food security. If I use any legal term that's not clear or say something too quickly, as my students always complain, let me know, okay? I'll presume that so far you understand what I want from you, but if not, stop me in the middle. Okay, so availability, accessibility, adequacy, and sustainability. Now, I don't want to talk so much now about those two because they're very interesting, but we don't have the time. I want to talk about the first two, and that in a minute you'll understand why. So what is, okay, I will mention adequacy for a moment. It should be, right to adequate food should not be interpreted in a narrow, restrictive sense. We equate it as a minimum package of calories, proteins, and other specific nutrients. I mean, we should understand that, and we later will mention this idea that a scholar called Michael Carlin, he called it decalorized food security. We should substack, do we get enough calories? But I want to talk more about availability. Now, availability in this definition talks about either feeding yourself directly, but that's less relevant for most people, or for well-functioning distribution, processing, and market systems that can move food from the site of production to where it is needed in accordance with demands. Whereas accessibility encompasses economic and physical accessibility. Now, I think that for many years until recently, we saw that the main problem is accessibility. I mean, those of us working on this topic, and this was very influenced by famous economist Sen, who said that the problem of the right to food is not one of lack of food, but lack of buying power, lack of economic access to food, function of entitlement, not of food availability as such, insufficient income and weakened purchasing power. And the question should be, how come people do not have the income? And hunger and I would say also food insecurity is a result of poverty and not inadequate aggregate volumes of food production. lack of access. Now, I think this is very much true still, but actually, I think that the crisis of the recent years, especially COVID, but also the war in Ukraine, actually should make us question this and say, yes, there is a problem with people who are poor and don't have access to food, and that's a fundamental problem. But, do I go back on this? Do we also have a problem of availability? Not in the sense that there's not enough food produced, but in the sense that we don't have a functioning distribution processing market systems that can move food from the site of production to where it is needed, especially on the global level. And so, does the story change with supply chain breakdown during COVID-19 and also during the war in Ukraine? And do we also have a problem of availability now, and which affects accessibility? Because lack of availability affects prices also, and makes it even harder for those who cannot access to access. So what do we see during COVID-19? We have seen, I would say, three major factors, as far as I know, that affect food insecurity. Lack of income to households, of course, who lost income because they lost their jobs. And even if they did get some support from the government, it wasn't enough. Not all of them got it. Self-employed not always got adequate. Definitely non-documented workers, for example, and asylum seekers didn't get anything. Okay, so that's another thing, and we know that's very basic, right? People lost their jobs, lost their income. That's affected access to food. A second one was disruption of social services, and the most famous was school lunches. I think there was data, a few 100 million kids worldwide lost their main hot meal, which they got in school. For example, in Uganda, where the lockdowns were very long, this became a major problem. But it's also a problem in Israel. And the third one is a global supply chain disruption with impact on food prices. So actually, we have seen, and I'll talk about this in a minute, we can also talk about behavioral changes during lockdown. On the other hand, maybe more people cook at home and it's healthier. On the other hand, maybe they eat more junk food, but there is some research on that, but I won't go into that. So I want to focus on this one, although all three are novel things that we had to face following COVID. And so we see restriction of movement of workers and of goods, closing of borders, closing of food factories. And we see that, and we know that today we are dependent on global trade for our food, and that gets disrupted. So just one example, Africa imports wheat and rice from Russia and Vietnam. Both those countries, at least in the beginning of the pandemic, restrict the exports. They're afraid, we don't know what's going to happen. We are going to restrict the exports of those products, and then the prices go up. And that affects other countries. So that's just an example. Now, post-COVID, this is just a recent report of the WFP and other groups talk about how this crisis, how global food prices rise to new heights as a result of combination of factors, uneven global economic recovery for COVID-19, and the supply chain disruption. I won't go into everything here because I don't want to read forever, but macroeconomic factors which have impact, I'm going down on the purchasing power of poorest households. Then we also have armed conflict. The same report talks about conflict and insecurity as key driver in some countries like Ethiopia, South Sudan, and Yemen. But we also know the effect of the war in Ukraine and Russia. Once again, for example, grain exports were disrupted in a way that affects also availability, not just accessibility of food. And then we have the climate crisis, obviously with the impact of weather-related disasters on acute food insecurity. And here, I wonder whether this also has effect, right, on accessibility, on availability, not only accessibility, because if we have droughts and we grow less food, so actually maybe the paradigm we were thinking about is different now, should be different from the same paradigm. So we see a renewed interest. How am I doing with the time? Renewed interest in food security is a global problem in food crisis, but can the right to food help us? Obviously, we cannot cook it and eat it, even if it's written in some nice document. Now, a few words about what's going on in Israel, and I'm not going to give the answers now, but just raise those questions. So we see growth of food insecurity during COVID, especially in some part of society like the Arab sector, unemployed, elderly, and more. We've seen also during COVID the story of the loss of school lunches for 500,000 kids and food security among children. And now, we need social protection. So what did we have, and I think this is something that we're still researching. So, for example, school lunches resources were diverted to give food to elderly people, which is fine and good maybe, but did we have enough programs to make sure that the children who lost school lunches got alternatives? I'm not sure. Now, something that happened during COVID, and all of us in Israel deal with food security are very concerned with about. There was, even before, a program from the Ministry of Welfare supported by the National Council of Food Security I mean, supported not financially, but as far as the idea, food security initiative, of handouts, of different forms of like vouchers and different programs to families suffering from food insecurity. During COVID, the Ministry of Interior, not the Ministry of Welfare, came out with a new food security initiative, not the Ministry of Welfare, of credit handouts based on, I allowed myself to write here the dubious criteria of those getting city council discounts. A dubious criteria because people who are, bigger experts on economy and welfare than me all say it's a very problematic criteria. It doesn't necessarily identify the people who suffer from food insecurity for a lot of reasons. Now, there was a petition against this during the pandemic. For those interested, I have a whole article on analyzing all the Supreme Court cases during the pandemic about effect of COVID restriction on human rights. So this is one of the petitions. The Israeli court. So I'm not going to go into it. There are here economic consideration, policy consideration of the government, notwithstanding what you hear now from the government that you have to stop this court, which intervenes in everything. The court does not intervene in many things, definitely intervenes very little in social economic rights. And this was one of the case. The court did not go into the merit. It said, I'm not going to go into this. Now, this program under the new government has been renewed. Now, I'm using the term clientelism here because, I'm usually very suspicious of those arguments that social programs are done for the ultra-Orthodox. But here, a major criteria here is the number of children in the household. The Ministry of Interior is from the ultra-Orthodox party. So I do think we see here clientelism, and we cannot disconnect it from the bigger question about the authoritarianism in Israel, the democratic decline, and clientelism as something which is typical to populist regimes, okay? So if you follow populist regime, clientelism is typical of them. That is that the government is serving clients, which are, the people who would support it in turn, okay? Now, under the new government budget, 1 billion shekel are going to give into food voucher based on discount in city tax, rather than other criteria, rather than programs offered by the welfare, which includes supply of fresh fruit and vegetables and counseling on nutrition, on work, on economic sufficiency. And this program will get much less funding, and the current program will get much more. Now, there's a legal debate about it. There's the Attorney General involved. As there may be in new court on June 19th, there's going to be a debate in the Knesset. I think, Dorit, you're going to be there, right? On Monday, June 19th is Monday, yes. So the RIT is, as first of you don't know, is very involved in this issue, and I'm also with her a member of the Academic Advisory Committee to the National Council on Food Security, which issued a few opinions against this program. But that's something that, okay, so what do we need to do? I guess, of course, we need to fight clientelism of this kind, but more broadly, we need to develop understanding of health during pandemics, and not only during pandemics, that is broad and is not about protecting health only for COVID, and say, because how is this phrased legally, for example, and also socially and politically in Israel? We have to protect health and life from COVID, so we can restrict other rights, like freedom of movement, education, religion, and et cetera, et cetera. But we have to think in a more holistic way that considers the effect on health of measures, including the effect on food insecurity, which affect health of the measures. Because the way that we are thinking about it, protecting our health from COVID, and then we have to restrict everything else, doesn't give us, the biggest story that the measures themselves may have effects which are detrimental on health. In this case, for example, also on food security. But then what solution do we offer? And unfortunately here, a very impoverished solution was offered. As I said, it's the Israeli Supreme Court in many cases balance the health of protection from COVID versus under interest, not a holistic understanding of health, which does not mean only protecting from the COVID disease. The position of court on food security so far has been very much non-interventionist. Can he judge the criteria in the new program? We'll see if it goes to the court. We don't know yet. I would say that actually it was a court petition that led to the creation of the National Council of Food Security. I also say that we should take rights out of judicial box and not think that our solution would necessarily be from the courts. We've seen it in Latin America, where there's a lot of social movement around the right to food, not necessarily in the court. Okay, so I would just end in saying that I mentioned the term 2 minutes, I'm finishing. Michael Carlin, in one of my favorite books on food security, talks about 3 stages. He talked about the calorization of food security, which we are still suffering from, the neoliberalization of food security, which we are still suffering with, and later the empty calorization of food security that we are still suffering with. So I think any program has to actually think, how do we overcome those problems? How do we address hidden hunger, malnutrition, micronutrient deficiency, not only undernutrition? How do we decalorize food security? How do we talk about not only our food status, do we have enough food in any specific day? Because at that day we did get some help. But food security means that we know that we'll also have enough food and adequate food the next day. And when we rely on aid and support from some distribution, we don't have food security. Maybe we have a good food status today. Okay, shall we deal not just with supply, but also demand in the sense of our ability to buy, what in public health they call downstream versus upstream, but I don't have time to go into that. Other idea that I often mentioned, supervision on food prices, healthy food baskets, that again, Dorit was very involved in advocating, but did not happen yet, that will be regulated by the state. Tomorrow, other changes, transfer payment, because we have to do with the bigger social economic inequalities. Okay, so I think I should end here, and thank you for listening.